Now, Congressman Adam Schiff, ranking member on the House Select Committee on Intelligence, and Representative Schiff, thank you for joining me as always. Good to see you.
You bet. Good to see you.
Let's talk about the agreement the White House reached to allow Congress some oversight on an Iranian nuclear deal. Do you envision any scenario where Congress's involvement might cause the Iran deal to fall apart?
It's possible, but I think we've averted the chance of Congress scuttling an agreement before we even see if we have one. And that was the risk with the Corker bill. And with respect to my Senate colleague, I don't think there was any necessity for us to vote on this before we even see if we have a deal. Congress always has the power to have a vote afterwards. It was fully expected we have a vote afterwards. But nonetheless, there has been a compromise worked out. The White House has embraced that compromise. And it certainly looks from the muted Iranian reaction like it's not going to risk scuttling negotiations in any way.
All right. This past week, Secretary of State, as you know, John Kerry reportedly held a private meeting on the Iran deal with a group of House Democrats. He received the standing ovation after his talk. So what did he say that most impressed you?
Well, obviously, he has a very in-depth knowledge of all of the ins and outs of the proposed framework and agreement. He went over, what it will mean in terms of Iran's capacity to build a nuclear weapon, how rigorous the inspections can be, how the snapback provisions would go. Really fleshed out a lot of the details that we hear more generally or generically in public. But the Secretary also made it clear that there is no deal yet. And I think what he was mostly appealing for is don't scuttle our chance to get this agreement. We may or may not, but if Congress is responsible for scuttling the deal, don't think that we're going to be able to keep our allies together on increased sanctions, because that will be very difficult. And I think that's a message that resonated.
Did he give you the confidence, sir, that the deal could keep Iran from ever creating a nuclear weapon? Would there be enough access to the nuclear facilities in Iran?
Well, certainly the Secretary thinks that this is a good straitjacket for Iran. I'm really reserving judgment until I see what the final deal is, if we get one. And for me, it will matter a lot whether we're able to inspect any suspicious areas, and if there's a mechanism to do that fairly quickly, whether we have a real snapback mechanism such that if Iran cheats or refuses to allow inspections, those sanctions can go back in short order, and we don't have to go through a lengthy United Nations or other process. I'd like to know more about the history of Iran's weapons program. So these are going to be some of the key issues for me in evaluating what that final agreement might look like.
How about if the agreement happens by the June 30th deadline, should the key sanctions immediately be lifted as Iran wants?
No, and I agree completely with the comments Senator Corker made earlier about that. No, they should be phased in so that we see whether Iran is meeting its commitments, so we have a chance to evaluate whether it's cheating or whether it's doing what it's supposed to under the agreement. So it will be phased in. It has to be phased in. And I can only think that the Ayatollah and President Rouhani are posturing right now, because I think they have to know that this is not going to happen right at the outset.
In terms of posturing, Iran held this military parade yesterday, and it featured these new weapons systems and a truck that carried a big sign with the words "Death to Israel" on it, along with chants of "Death to America." It seems, Representative Schiff, that we have been hearing that for so long, we become desensitized. So is it at all naive to believe that it's just for their internal nationalist fervor, and it's not something that Iran as a whole truly believes?
Well, you have this division within Iran, and that is that a lot of the Iranian people, probably most of the Iranian people, are actually quite pro-Western. And ironically, when you have these regimes that are so bitterly anti-American, their populations are often the most pro-American. But you certainly do have a very conservative wing. You've got the military that has a deeply embedded economic and other interest in the status quo that is going to be, repelling against any kind of an agreement, any kind of accommodation with the West. And those chants, the "Death to America" stuff, really plays to that conservative crowd. I thought it was interesting that at one point when the Ayatollah was speaking, I think it was the Ayatollah, not the president, to a group, and they began a chant of "Death to America," at least the translation was, "Yes, of course, death to America." Well, you could read that in a couple ways. It might be, well, yes, of course, death to America. We always say death to America. Or it could be, of course, that he really means it. But I think it's playing to a conservative audience in Iran.
Okay. Switching gears here, I want to ask you about the Ohio man who was arrested for allegedly going to Syria, getting terror training there, coming back here with the intent to kill members of the military or the police. Do you get a sense U.S. intelligence has a firm handle on all these type of actors here in the U.S.?
Well, we have what I would describe certainly a significant number, but a manageable number of people that we have to keep track of. Europe has a much bigger problem. There are many thousands that have left Europe to join the fight, and many of those are coming home or trying to come home. Do we have a sufficient handle that it makes me comfortable? I'm not comfortable with it. I'm not sure I'm ever going to be comfortable with it. And if you look at the chronology of this Ohio man, it's reported that he came back in the country in December, wasn't arrested until February. And that means that in that interim time, and those were state charges in February, it was only recently we had the federal charges. In that interim time that he was in the United States prior to arrest, we didn't know enough either about his presence or probably more likely we knew he was here, but we didn't know enough about what he had been doing in Syria to make an arrest earlier. So obviously we have limited visibility into what these Americans may be doing in Syria. If they're affiliating and providing material support for terrorists, they can be arrested. If they're there on a humanitarian mission, that's obviously a different story. But it is a very challenging task and one that keeps us up at night.
Okay. Last question here, this one about the severe drought there in your state there. How have your constituents been affected by the restrictions on water use, and what are they telling you? Do you have a sense of the real scope of the issue here?
Well, I represent an urban and suburban area, so the way my constituents are principally affected is they now have to really ration their water. They've had to cut back, particularly on outside irrigation, which is not that big a deal. It's where 40% of urban water use goes. But they're being instructed to have shorter showers and to retrofit their toilets to be water-saving toilets and take what are modest steps but can have a really significant impact on water use. The issue is much more acute in the agricultural areas where it's, live or die. It's really about jobs and surviving and maintaining these farms. And that, I think, is really the area where I'm sure those members of Congress are hearing much more, and it's a much more dire situation.
All right, Representative Adam Schiff, always good to see you. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Alex.